And now brings us to the big one. Our former president, guilty of 34 counts for election interference. He is the first former president to be found guilty of felony in a court of law. The indictment brought by a grand jury of 23 New Yorkers and guilty conviction by a jury of 12 New Yorkers. And this brings in the United States in line with other Western democracies who hold their leaders, such as France, Italy, Israel, who hold their leaders to account. What are you guys thinking about this? Did you have any reactions to this? No?
I mean, I was like, oh, cool. They got it on paper, but, you know, what? I mean, he's still running, so I think that's kind of weird that you can do anything like that and still run the country. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
It's just odd. I'm like wow, and they're letting anybody do this at this point.
Yeah, I'm like, all right, great, but like nothing is gonna
what
happen.
Happens, you know, he's still running, so that's weird.
Well, I didn't think he wouldn't run, but so if you do my parents always said, if you do the crime, you have to do the time. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time. I remember them saying that to me over and over when I was a kid. Oddly enough, they're Trump supporters now. So, but I mean, you know, we don't talk about that type of thing, but I am very curious about this. So the ABC News Ipsos poll, they polled 781 adults on May 31st and June 1st. So that was right after the verdict. The verdict was announced on May 30th in the afternoon. So they went the next 2 days, and they polled 781 Americans. And they discovered... They asked, was this verdict correct? 50% said it is correct. DJ, can you put up that blue one? I think it is. The ABC Ipsos poll. That's it. 50% said the verdict is correct. 27% said it's not correct. And 23% said they don't know if the verdict is correct or not. Now, I gave it to the 23% because if you're not following the trial, then you can't really make much of an assessment. If you followed the trial closely, then you were probably able to see. I think it had like 22 witnesses. It went over, I don't know how many weeks. 9 weeks, I don't know. Like it went a long time, at like 22 witnesses. I mean, it was a pretty involved, very intricate trial, and both sides, the prosecution and it was like the American justice system at work. And this is what the jury came back with. So the 23 said they don't know if the verdict is correct or not. I thought that was that was fair. 50% believing it's correct. Well, I hope they did follow the trial. But the 27% said it's not correct. I was really curious about those people. And then I went to the CBS YouGov poll. The CBS YouGov poll even made me more curious. Is Trump fit to be president now that he's convicted? And a whopping 40% said yes. 40%. So I'm like, from a psychological point of view, who thinks that this is fair? So let me ask, what are the psychological mechanisms at work that help create this robust support base that remains loyal to Trump? So I looked at that and looked at 10 possible reasons. So let's go through these and you guys tell me if this makes sense to you. Number one, it's something called confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is a concept in psychology. People tend to favor information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs and disregard information that contradicts them. So if they already had positive beliefs and belief that former President Trump could not do such a thing, they wouldn't be swayed by a guilty verdict in a trial.
No, it'd be like being part of a cult.
It could be. Well, I'm not assessing whether they are or not with that particular thing. I'm just, saying yes, they could be in a cult.
But in a cult, that's how it would
actually. Yes, you're correct. Trump supporters may interpret the guilty verdict as biased or unjust and reinforce their existing support. So they're like, oh, he's being treated unfairly. This just proves that he's as good as he is. So that's kind of like how confirmation bias works. It has us only filter in information that we deem acceptable, and we filter out information that we don't want to hear.
That seems to be a big thing in America, I feel like.
It's a big thing everywhere. Confirmation bias is kind of one of the, if you got to know a psychological concept, that's a good one to know.
Well, especially I think with social media, like you seek out what you want, and then the algorithm knows what you want, so then it'll just show you that.
It'll filter it out for you.
Yeah.
This is why I'm not a fan of social media for that many reasons. That, and I just can't see any more abs. But
it's summertime.
No, but the bottom line is, yes, that's exactly right. They do that for you, and then you end up getting in this warped world, which, DJ, you are really ahead of the game, because we're going to come to that one. But number 2 is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is another good psychological term to know about. Cognitive dissonance, I'm going to read this for you. When confronted with information that conflicts about their beliefs, individuals experience cognitive dissonance. So if you have these two psychological concepts, like and you walk that person who always walks old ladies across the street, you think he's really great, but then you find out the 100th old lady, he stole her purse. Like, you have to put this together. Who is this person? So you got these two conflicting ideas. And that's kind of a rough idea, but basically we have two conflicting ideas, and we have to, when we have cognitive dissonance, we have to resolve it in a particular direction. So to reduce the discomfort, the psychological discomfort we're having here, Trump supporters might rationalize the verdict as politically motivated or dismiss it as part of a larger conspiracy.
Instead of understanding it.
Possibly, yes. So it might be that, they rationalize it that way, and then that way it kind of reduces the psychological stress.
So it's easier.
For
them, we all believe that.
We all do this when we have conflicting ideas. And one thing I am really grateful for, having gone through grad school, is they force you to have to sit with competing ideas. And even this morning, I was talking to someone who attended a lecture with someone who clerked for a previous Supreme Court justice, and she said that the person who clerked said this particular person, which was Sandra Day O'Connor, she was the first female Supreme Court justice. We're going to do the first female. That'll be our other theme today besides college students. But she was the first female Supreme Court justice, and she apparently would hire a liberal clerk and a conservative clerk, and when she had to figure out things, she would have them sort of duke it out, or work with each other to get some kind of opinion where they uncovered and listened to each other and came to a more of a consensus opinion. I thought that was pretty profound, when we've got to be able to hold all sorts of information. When we only go to one point of view, it actually limits us. So that was number 2, is cognitive dissonance. Number 3 is identity, group loyalty. For many supporters, Trump is more than a political figure. He represents their cultural identity and values. And group loyalty and social identity theory explain why people stick with their in-group, which here is Trump supporters despite negative information. So when we feel this group loyalty, we feel a part of this group, and that's very powerful. I mean, are there certain groups you feel part of, and you're like, you give them a lot of grace, the group, and you want to be a part of that group, and then also you don't want to be rejected by the group. And what the group does, that's called our reference group, we often follow along. and we learn from the group. So group identity and social identity can be extremely powerful.
That makes sense, especially with like smaller towns that are like a lot more conservative, that you're kind of like standing out as like the sore thumb in a big wave of like, you know, people thinking a certain way. So it's like you better follow along with that way of thinking.
I am always interested in like a small town with the person who has the one unusual opinion. In fact, in every organization, you always want people who have conflicting opinions, because otherwise you get into this concept, another psychological concept called groupthink. And in groupthink, everyone thinks the same way, and it reduces creativity. So we don't want groupthink, and that's why like with Sandra Day O'Connor, at least there, she resolved that by having people with conflicting ideas. And we see that, I think it was Lincoln who had his team of rivals. He had people that would be in his cabinet who didn't agree with each other because they could help come up with the best solutions.
And do you think or feel like groupthink is happening currently?
Yes.
Okay. I just didn't.
Of course there are. Yeah. I think that's part of the problem. So supporting Trump has become an expression of loyalty for the group identity. Number 4 is moral disengagement. Supporters might morally disengage from Trump's actions by minimizing the seriousness of the charges, comparing them to the worst actions of others, or displacing responsibility. So this is basically, it allows them to maintain their support even though they believe the negative actions are taken, without feeling guilty or conflicted, because they rationalize it by saying, well, other people do it. So this is an old Russian tactic. I don't know if you guys know about this, called whataboutism. And this tactic is basically where you just point at everybody else. Say, what about him? What about him? What about him? And then the more alternative possibilities we introduce, the more watered down our original concern is. What's so powerful about this is I use this positively with people who might get locked on an idea that might be damaging to them. Like an idea that might be damaging, it's like, when I go to work, I'm going to be fired because my boss called me and said he needed to talk to me before work started. And you're like, well, that is one possibility. But what else might be a possibility? And what else might be a possibility? And, can we help reduce the anxiety by having some other things that you can hold true? And it will water down the anxiety around that particular fear. Like maybe he just wants you to get in early because he wants to give you a special role in the meeting, or wants to give you a certain project or task, or didn't like the way you performed on something and wanted to give you feedback. There could be many reasons for that.
That's a cool way to think about it, for sure.
But unfortunately, whataboutism is used here for negative, where we look at other people, and I hear it all the time. People are like, it's very interesting. There's another trial. The other president, President Biden, is having his son on trial. People are like, what about that? What about that? So, yeah, that doesn't take away from the other thing. So we have to be very careful about the whataboutism here. Number 5, this is actually very important, which is called charismatic leadership. And Trump's charismatic leadership style influences confidence in people, assertiveness, his includes confidence, assertiveness, and a strong persona. This can lead followers to place trust in him and view his actions more leniently. So charismatic leadership actually has people kind of give up some of their own critical thinking because they want to follow the charismatic leader. Charismatic leaders often inspire loyalty and devotion and can transcend legal or ethical violation.
Sounds about right.
But do we want a charismatic leader? This was what was so interesting to me about Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president, because she said she wanted to govern Mexico without distinction. She wants to get in there and do the work. Is that good, or should she be a charismatic, inspirational leader for Mexico? Should she be Evita Peron? Was Evita Peron good for Argentina?
No. No.
She made a good musical. So I watched this TED Talk on good leadership called Good Leadership Looks Boring. And I'm like, wow, I have to watch that. And this historian actually talks about something called the action fallacy. It's our mistaken belief that the best leaders are the best leaders because they generate the most noise, the most action, and the most sensational activities in the most dramatic circumstances. This is the action fallacy. And he said that people confuse a good story with good leadership.
Oh, yeah.
And there it is with Eva Peron, you know. I mean, she wasn't really and Juan Peron. But she... But, you know, it's a good story, but it was a good leadership. And good leadership, he advocated, and he had lots of examples of this and had written 2 books on particular leaders. He was a leadership expert. Good leadership results in a boring story. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So maybe we don't necessarily want charismatic leadership.
I mean, I'm cool with having a peaceful, life.
Yeah.
I don't need the excitement.
Boring leaders are the best leaders. They get the most done. And what's interesting is we did have a charismatic leader in Barack Obama. He was quite charismatic. And he was a good storyteller, etc. But Barack Obama did a lot to subvert that and to, be a worker and be more of a workhorse, which I think was a very smart move for him. Instead of sticking his neck out and constantly, basically he's like, okay, it got me in, now I'm going to do the work. Which
that's
was
what you would expect.
That's what you would hope. Yeah. Okay, number 6 is perceived persecution. Trump has consistently framed himself as a victim of a witch hunt by the media and political opponents. This narrative can resonate with supporters who feel similarly marginalized and distrustful of institutions, reinforcing their support for him as someone who is fighting a common enemy. And I think this is a big one. This is actually, when we look at the deaths of despair, which there's being people pushing back on that concept, but I think it's a solid one, that there are groups of people out there who are living on the margins, who've had a lot of adversity in their lives, and who die of these behavioral means, because they become alcoholic or opioid addicts or overweight and other things. They live unhealthy lives, and then they end up dying earlier than other people and even commit suicide. So these kinds of deaths of despair can often, these people, before they get to that point, of course, they feel marginalized and distrustful, and they feel like they're kind of out there. And here in Donald Trump, that they have someone who is kind of their person. As a client put it to me once, he said, and I thought this was quite brilliant, he said, he's not just a bully, he's their bully. He's their bully who's out there fighting for them as a bully. I mean, maybe that's what he's doing. So they feel like he has their back.
I'm wondering what he's fighting.
Them. Them.
Human rights?
I think one of his longtime workers, Barbara Rez, she wrote a book, very interesting. And, I'm always interested in people's personalities, and maybe this is a little too much. But Barbara Rez said, it's been consistent since day one. He always felt other people had it out to get him. So that's consistent from day one. So he kind of comes from that place, and
that's the mentality.
That's the mentality, and he's going to filter in that information. So that's going to be his confirmation bias.
It almost seems like a reality TV show with him.
Well, he was in one.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I feel like that's how he's playing it all out.
In fact, I'm going to talk about that reality. Thank you, Brian. Media influence and echo chambers. Supporters often consume, this is number 7, supporters often consume media that aligns with their beliefs, creating echo chambers where they're exposed primarily to information that supports Trump. Things like Fox TV or Newsmax, or I can't follow all of them. Whatever the one, the Twitter thing.
Oh, X.
What's it called? Yeah, X has certainly gone more that way, but also he has his own Twitter.
Oh, their
ripoff.
own platform.
Yeah, I
right?
can't remember
don't
what
know
it's
it
called.
is.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm sure someone will correct me. But basically,
We don't need to know.
selective.
Doesn't
Well,
matter.
I think it's important. But nonetheless, if you're on there, you're probably going to only get positive information about him. So selective exposure reinforces their views and shields them from dissenting perspectives. But what you were just saying, Brian, I also put in this. This may have started from something called halo effect, another psychological principle. I always teach this when I'm teaching like college students. I'm like, halo effect. Let's talk about this. Halo effect, when you have a first impression, it's lasting. So you develop a positive halo or a negative halo. So when you're meeting a college student or you're going to a job, you want to develop that positive halo up front. But a lot of people's first exposure to Donald Trump was through The Apprentice TV show. That was his reality show he was on. And I never saw it, but I heard he was very good in the show, and a lot of people really enjoyed the show. So that past exposure gave them what we call a positive halo toward him, and it gave people the benefit. They gave him the benefit of the doubt because they saw him as a charismatic businessman, and they saw him as very competent, and so they filter in information thinking that was reality. But that was a TV show.
He knows how to get the ratings, and I feel like that's how he's playing it out.
I mean, he's a PR master. I will say, a PR master.
Even if it's a straight up lie, I feel like they're still so on it that you are like, oh, they're right.
I'm sorry I didn't realize about time. We're going to go through these next ones as quickly as we can. Number 8, authority and trust in leadership. Some individuals have high trust in authority and established leaders. If they perceive Trump as legitimate and authoritative, they may be more inclined to trust his denials and explanations over the court's verdict. Again, remember that action fallacy, giving credence to a leader who generates the most noise. Also, nostalgia. Number 9, nostalgia and reluctance to change. Trump's messaging often includes themes of restoring past greatness, challenging the status quo, and appealing to those who feel disenchanted with the current political and social dynamics. This emotional appeal can overshadow legal issues. This could also represent something called the sunk cost fallacy. We have a lot of concepts at work here. The sunk cost fallacy is a phenomenon whereby a person is reluctant to abandon a strategy or course of action because they're so invested in it. So sunk costs can relate to financial investments, can relate to psychological, emotional, time investments. Like we get involved in some, can be a marriage, that you stay in something even though it's clear that abandonment would be more beneficial, like leaving it would be more beneficial. So sometimes it assists us, it helps us get through rough times, like in a marriage, and sometimes it really hurts us, like maybe if we're staying with an investment that just continually goes down. And number 10 is fear of change. Fear of political and social changes could have helped with the shift in leadership that can drive continued support for Trump. His supporters keep being told and might fear that the alternative would be worse. We always hear that, even though the alternative is literally in the office at this moment, leading them to cling to their preferred leader despite legal troubles. These psychological mechanisms that we just discussed combine to create a robust support of the support base that remains loyal to Trump, interpreting negative events in ways that might reinforce their commitment to him. So let me go through those one more time. Confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, identity and group loyalty, moral engagement, charismatic leadership, perceived persecution, media influence and echo chambers, authority and trust in leadership, nostalgia and reluctance to change, and fear of change. So there we have it, folks. Those are the 10 reasons why maybe people don't really care about that verdict and actually are just digging their heels in deeper. Some folks, at least.
Well, I hope the U.S. changes that at some point, and we don't have to go all about that.
Well, I think, we'll just have to see how things go in November. That's the big election, and, I hope everything goes the way that is most beneficial to this country.
To the people,
To the people. That's right. Well, thank you, DJ, Sammy G, and Brian. That wraps up the show for today. I want to remind you to like, subscribe, give us 5 stars. Links to the studies that we talk about, go to my YouTube page at youtube.com/Dr. Greg, including that. I have a link to that leadership video that I think is really great. Also, if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, hit me up on the socials at Ask Dr. Greg. Should have thought about that when I got it. And this is Dr. Greg, Brian, and DJ Sammy G. Until next time, be present, be flexible, and be kind.